earlier, there are a number of concepts and ideas that are put forth in today's Parsha, Shoftim.
So Jeff, can I just say I'm recording, so if someone doesn't want to be on the recording, you can turn off your video.
Thank you, Elaine. Forgot about that.
All right, go ahead.
So, again, I use my Jewish learning for my go-to site when I'm doing a Dvar, and there were a lot of things that I would love to have to talk about today. But as I pointed out at the beginning, there are a number of challenging paragraphs or, commandments in here. And I found one commentary by Daniel Septimus, who kind of struck a chord with me this week. And he entitles it, Engage All Texts. At a time when Jewish influence has increased, how do we approach unethical commandments, or at least what we see as unethical commandments, like some of the ones that we had that I mentioned earlier? Any thoughts on that? How do you approach what you perceive to be as unethical commandments?
I ignore it.
Okay. So if we ignore it, does that mean that the Torah is, for lack of a better term, necessarily wrong?
Why not?
Well, just to play devil's advocate for a moment, if the Torah is wrong, could God have given the Torah with God knowing all, and we're saying that that aspect is now wrong?
Yeah. Well, I'll speak for myself. The heritage and the imagery of God giving us the Torah is something beautiful, but I don't really believe that God gave us the Torah.
Okay. Anyone else have any thoughts on how do we deal with some of these perceived unethical commandments?
I think there's a provision in the Torah that we can interpret things. God gives us the right to interpret the Torah, and that allows us to come up with a new interpretation in modern times, whereas something in the past may have made sense for whatever reasons, but there is a provision in the Torah that we are to use it as a living document in our times, and not necessarily be constrained by ancient practices.
Okay. And at least from all the commentaries that I've read, I think, Howard, the majority of rabbis are in your corner on this one. That we have the right to reinterpret some of these challenging verses, not necessarily to get rid of them, but so, for example, one of the things is, there are a number of situations in the Torah that prescribe capital punishment for XYZ offense, and there are several of them. Yet, the rabbis of the Talmud felt very challenged by this, and they put all these fences around those provisions so that you could not actually commit capital punishment. So, for example, one of the things that we learned in today's Parsha is that in order to convict someone, especially of capital punishment, you have to have at least, if not more, 2 witnesses. One witness alone, you cannot convict someone of capital punishment. And there's another verse in here today. We've heard this line before: an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life, etc. And the rabbis of the Talmud came to interpret that capital punishment is the only crime that we would do something, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Everything else, more civil cases and what have you, it becomes a matter of appropriate compensation. And the rabbis of the Talmud weren't the only ones that came to this conclusion. There were many other societies that also followed this precept. And there are some societies, unfortunately, that take those words literally, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, even to this day. If I'm not mistaken, I think in one or more of the countries of Arabia, and referring to a lot of the Arabian Peninsula there, not just one country, if a woman, I believe, engages in illicit sexual activity, the punishment is usually that her hand is chopped off. And that's even to this day in many countries. So, Howard, I would tend to agree with you that the rabbis were very uncomfortable with a lot of these provisions that are actually noted in the Torah. So if we're trying to create a just society, at what point do we, quote, reinterpret the Torah, or do we follow reinterpretations like from the various rabbis over the century that allow us to kind of skirt around that issue a little bit? At what point do we say, no, we're just getting rid of it and we just go this way? Or do we have to create some sort of a way how that, we get around something like that?
Is it worth, when something is obviously wrong? I mean, the biggest sin you can commit against God is not to use the brain that He gave you. So is it worth that much time when something is obviously cruel and wrong to spend that much time trying to explain it away? And is that tendency to try to explain, provide a palatable explanation for things that are clearly wrong, damaging itself?
Okay. So the one question I would follow that up with, who gets to determine whether a precept or a law is right or wrong?
Well, obviously me.
Okay.
More seriously, I think all of us are obligated to use our brains to do that.
Okay. Basha.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Bill was kidding, but not kidding. I think we all need to figure that out for ourselves. I think we all need to get educated first so we know what we're thinking about and talking about and understanding. But I mean, that's why there's different Jewish groups. Orthodox see things very differently than Reconstructionist groups. It doesn't mean one's better than the other. It's just their frame of where they see it and how they interpret it. And that's what I love about Judaism is the interpretations are amazing. I mean, you talked about you go to the resource you go to help with your Dvar, but there's tons of resources you could go to help with that Dvar, and some of them will have a different perspective.
Absolutely. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why I like the opportunity to do some of these Dvars, because it actually forces me to go and look up some of these different opinions and, find something that resonates with me. So, as you mentioned, Basha, we need to study, we need to learn so that we can really truly understand these principles and, what they're all about. And sometimes different commentators will have a variety of different ideas. Rick, I think I saw your hand up.
Yeah, so I think that we kind of have to distinguish between the infractions and the punishments. I think most of what we have difficulty with is the prescribed punishments. But the punishments, in a way, tell you the seriousness of the offense, whether it's a felony or a misdemeanor, you know, what level. But you don't, rather than take them literally, take them as sort of a ranking of how serious the infraction is. So it's just a different way of understanding it, rather than treat it as a literal, this is how you have to punish the people who do it.
But people are punished for things that I wouldn't think today, well, I wouldn't think are infractions.
Yeah. And, you know, this is why we have this constant tension, you know, every year. If let's say we didn't see something as an infraction, yet we come to the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur liturgy, and there's a whole litany of sins or, you know, perceived wrongdoings that we announce every year. But when maybe we don't see some of those as, you know, the wrong way to go. So I think it's a combination of that. It's not only the learning, but it's also trying to understand what the punishment might be all about, and maybe having us look at it in a more global sense, like what Rick is talking about, I think. Any other thoughts on this whole idea of just society versus, you know, individual rights and introspection? Any other thoughts on this? Not right now? Okay. So let me just share a couple of things that I came across. And again, this is from Daniel Septimus. It's not only judges who are responsible for maintaining an ethical and just judicial system. Shoftim also delineates the rules of legal testimony, which presume innocence and seek to ensure that witnesses be corroborated and accountable. The Talmud expands upon these laws and views this area of social and civil justice as a matter of concern for the divine. He goes on to say from the Babylonian tractate, he quotes, 3, the Holy One hates. He who says one thing with his mouth and another in his heart. He who possesses evidence in favor of his neighbor, but fails to testify on his behalf. And he who, seeing something improper in his neighbor, acts as the sole witness against him. And there are other laws that I mentioned that are designed to facilitate an ethical society. I talked about, you know, how you approach your enemies and so forth. So he goes on to say that the call for a just court system at the beginning of the Torah, of the portion from today, is also far from simple. While the Torah articulates clear guidelines in support of judicial impartiality and fairness, for example, explicitly prohibiting judges from giving preferential treatment and taking bribes, there's no indication that the Torah extends tzedek tirdov, justice shall you pursue beyond the courts to social justice. Even more challenging to progressive sensibilities, judges and officers were actually expected to enforce religious law, not just civil and criminal law. And in a stark articulation of this requirement, there's a medieval commentary called Sefer HaChinuch. It explains the job of the Shoftim and the Shotrim as follows: to appoint judges and officers who should enforce the observance of the mitzvot of the Torah and should return to it against their will those who stray from the path of truth. For with this method, we can establish our religious system of law, while fear of our officers and judges is cast over the mass population. So basically, he's saying that the Sefer HaChinuch, the commandment to appoint judges and officers, is aimed at establishing a just society ruled by religious law with enforcement that's generating fear among its citizens. Not a concept that most of us would probably subscribe to. So we're all aware that when we turn to Jewish tradition for teachings that inspire us to work for social justice, we often turn a blind eye to texts that can inspire the opposite. Religious paternalism, inequality, brutal forms of capital punishment, and yes, even race-based genocide, which there's an example of even in today's Parsha. But is this okay? Can we credibly cite Jewish teachings that encourage a better world when there exist parallel teachings that could lead to a worse one? I think yes, but only with these conditions: that we are honest about which texts we are excluding from active duty, and that we study not only those traditions that promote our social agendas, but those that contradict it, because neglected texts left unattended have a nasty way of coming back to life in more virulent forms. And in essence, we've seen this just over the last few months. So now with the state of Israel, in the past, Jews haven't really been in a state of power to enforce this, but now we have our own state. So the feeling is that the ethical ante has been upped significantly. All right? So scattered amongst Judaism's most noble and righteous teachings are passages that are anachronistic at best and immoral at worst. We first have to identify these, whatever their source: biblical, rabbinic, medieval, modern. And as we engage texts that inspire us to pursue social justice, we must at the same time engage those texts that can inspire violence and oppression. Whether we condemn these texts or merely note their difficulty, they're our responsibility. If we ignore them and fail to forge communal opinions about them, we also risk the possibility of them being resurrected and reclaimed and possibly being used against us. And we've seen efforts at anti-Semitism all throughout the centuries, probably based on many of these difficult passages. And he finishes with, perhaps we can see this consciousness-raising re-examination as the fulfillment of another famous command in Parshat Shoftim: Uviata hara mikerbecha, you shall purge the evil from your midst. And this is the way he looks at this. And as we try to reset ourselves for the coming year, now that we're in the month of Elul, one other thing that I found that really struck another chord with me, and this one is from Rabbi Matthew Sofer, all right? And he goes on to say that there's a beautiful Hasidic teaching that says there are 5 most important mitzvot in the entire Jewish tradition, and the first is actually from today's Torah portion. And he labels them as Tamim Tihiyeh, be wholehearted with God; Shaviti Adonai, always place God before you; V'ahavta l'reyecha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself; Bechol drachecha da'ehu, wherever you go, recognize God; and Hatzniya lechet im Elohecha, walk humbly with your God. And he has a very interpretation here, because he says that together, these 5 teachings constitute a new gestalt in the form of an acrostic. The first letter of each of these teachings, Tov, Shen, Vav, Bet, and Hey, spell the Hebrew word teshuvah, which is the Jewish concept of return or repentance. This week, we began the month of Elul, the month in which we practice behaviors urging us to return to our holiest selves. Our Torah portion calls out, from today, the human being is the tree of the field. Are we helping or hurting? Are we using words lovingly or harshly? Are we helping ourselves grow or cutting ourselves down? Midrash Rabbah teaches that every blade of grass has its own angel, nudging it from heaven and whispering to it, grow, grow. Welcome to the month of Elul, a season in which we, like blades of grass, like the trees of the field, return again, moving toward creation as our tradition whispers to us, grow, grow. Shabbat Shalom.
Yasher Koach.
Yasher Koach.